Good morning. Good morning. And once again, it's good to see you all here today. Well, last week we talked about Rohatsu, the celebration of the Buddha's awakening. And we had been talking about previously the Heart Sutra, which was recited prior to the meditation period. And I think the two are closely related because the Heart Sutra is an effort using language to, like poetry, to express the inexpressible, to point us to what exactly the Buddha awakened to. What did the Buddha's awakening involve? How can we understand it? I think a clue about what the Buddha awakened to is his subsequent life, how he spent the next 45 years or so. In a constant mode of simplicity and service, primarily teaching, trying in his own way, using skillful means to express the inexpressible. So we've gone through most, or at least half, of the Heart Sutra, and I'd like to continue with the next portion, which is surprisingly dense. The translation I'll be reading first is from the Soto Shu. It's sort of the official Soto Zen organization authorized translation into English. With nothing to attain, a bodhisattva relies on prajna paramita, and thus his mind is without hindrance. Without hindrance, there is no fear. Far beyond all inverted views, one realizes nirvana. All Buddhas of past, present, and future rely on prajna paramita and thereby attain unsurpassed, complete, perfect enlightenment. So that is the Soto Shu translation. There are many, many, as you can imagine, translations. I would like, just for comparison today, to read the same section as translated by Red Pine, a Western Buddhist scholar and teacher. Therefore, Shariputra, without attainment, bodhisattvas take refuge in prajna paramita and live without walls of the mind, and thus without fears. They see through delusions and finally nirvana. All Buddhas, past, present, and future, also take refuge in prajnaparamita and realize unexcelled perfect enlightenment. So there's a lot packed in there. And in the Soto Shu translation, we've incorporated an apparent contradiction, because the section that I read started with nothing to attain, and it ended with attain complete, unsurpassed, perfect enlightenment. And we'll get more into that apparent contradiction in a few minutes. Well, first of all, this word prajnaparamita, which we've encountered before, often translated as unsurpassed, complete, perfect enlightenment. Paramita being complete enlightenment, or not perfect enlightenment, having gone from unenlightenment to enlightenment. Paramita also translated as wisdom, complete, perfect wisdom. And this seems to be whatever prajnaparamita is, it seems to be what the Heart Sutra is pointing toward, is directing us to. And it also seems to be associated with this concept of emptiness, or shunyata. Of the connectedness and fluidity of all things, of all phenomena, of everything that we experience. So with nothing to attain, a bodhisattva relies on prajnaparamita, and thus the mind is without hindrance. Now, this hindrance is a term that is used in other Buddhist teachings. And as is the case with many such terms, it has been formalized and refined and associated with a list of three things, three types of hindrance. Hindrance related to karma, or habitual patterns of habit energy, of what we tend to do or what we tend to think because we have done so in the past. And the second hindrance is termed klesha, or related to emotions, related to anger or lust, or emotions that tend to throw us off track, that tend to hinder our wise behavior. And then the last hindrance, surprisingly perhaps, is hindrance related to nenya, or knowledge, in the sense of thinking we know what we don't really know. That knowledge which presumes. that knowledge which leads to a kind of entitlement. That is a kind of hindrance as well. So freeing oneself of those hindrances, without hindrance, there is no fear. It's interesting that this fear, the word used for fear here, as a translation into fear from the Sanskrit, can also be translated trembling. But it's interesting that fear is what was chosen as the consequence of abandonment of these hindrances, because it's so central to so much of our distress, suffering, fear. There are all kinds of fear. There's fear of injury and death. It's a very fundamental fear. There's fear of failure, embarrassment, as we interact in the world and pay attention to what we think others may think of us. And then there's fear of loss, fear of not having what we need in the future. So the composer of the Heart Sutra, or the spokesperson, Avalokiteshvara, is trying to tell us that these fears are related to the hindrances, and that without these hindrances, these fears lose substance. Far beyond all inverted views, one realizes nirvana. Now, and this is the Soto Shu translation, far beyond all inverted views, one realizes nirvana. That word inverted can also be translated, I think Joan Sutherland translates it nicely as topsy-turvy views. Sometimes it's translated as perverted views, but that has a particular connotation in English that's probably best avoided. But inverted or topsy-turvy views, upside-down views is another translation. Things we think we know. And far beyond these views, these hindrances, one realizes nirvana. Now, Red Pine, in his commentary on the Heart Sutra, has a particular view about this. In that he translates it differently. As they see through delusions and finally See through is also applied to nirvana. See through nirvana. They see through delusions and nirvana, as if nirvana is also a delusion. And I think that's perhaps helpful, particularly for practitioners in the West, where a common theme is the pursuit of nirvana, of some special state, of some place, some well-defined place called nirvana that we can arrive at through a lot of effort, that is reserved for very special people who do special things for a prolonged period of time, or are suddenly blessed with nirvana that comes from who knows where. The reason Red Pine feels like he can translate it that way is that there are different versions, different variants of the Sanskrit Heart Sutra from which these translations are derived. And in some variants, it seems like the verb see through applies to nirvana as well as inverted views. In other versions, it seems like there is realization or even attainment of nirvana. All Buddhas of past, present, and future rely on prajnaparamita, and thereby attain unsurpassed, complete, perfect enlightenment. Then we sort of re-encounter that contradiction between nothing to attain and attainment of this presumed goal. Which Red Pine sidesteps by saying they realize unexcelled perfect enlightenment. Realization, attainment is something that we think of or like an achievement, like if you work real hard, you'll attain something. Or if you look in the right place, you'll attain it. It's a more or less static goal, kind of like a diploma. If you get through 12th grade, you'll attain a diploma. But realization is something different. Realization is suddenly being aware of what's already there, of seeing things differently, and recognizing something that has always been there. So in this case, I prefer Red Pine's translation, which, to my limited knowledge, is justified from the Sanskrit texts that are available. Realization of wisdom beyond wisdom. Now, last time we talked about this notion, the question was raised as to whether all of this teaching is compatible with joy. After all, the teachings involve, well, everything's just moving around. Everything is in flux, fluid. You just don't know what's going to happen next. And not knowing what's going to happen next, or perhaps predicting inevitable failure, inevitable loss, inevitable death, it's difficult to feel joy. I'll just relate an incident that actually happened yesterday. I was at the grocery store doing some shopping, and I had a list and I was looking for things. And all of a sudden, I noticed that there was a woman carrying a baby. And I estimated the baby's age couldn't be more than about 6 to 8 weeks. It looked like the kind of baby that people bring back for their 6 weeks checkup after delivery. And the baby had this expression on its face. It was looking around. It had an expression of almost amazement, awe at this grocery store scene. Of course, the baby didn't know. I call it the baby, and I refer to, I don't give it a gender because it was dressed in neutral clothing. And at that age, you can't really tell whether it's a boy or a girl. In a sense, it's unhindered by gender, unhindered by knowing it's in a grocery store, unhindered by knowing that the reason we're here is for shopping. It was just colors and light and sounds and movement and shapes. Amazing. Perhaps the first time the baby had ever been in a grocery store. And looking in the baby's face, there was just joy. At that amazement, at that awe. And then the woman moved on, and I moved on. But the memory of joy is fresh. So that baby will grow up, change into goodness knows what. But at that moment, in that experience, was joy. So joy comes and joy goes, and sadness likewise comes and goes. So this talk of emptiness, talk of wisdom beyond wisdom, doesn't erase human experience, but it clarifies it and removes it from the binding of wanting things to stay the same, wanting things to be a certain way. Prajnaparamita, I don't think, is a destination, but a way of life, a way of being in the world, a way of moving through the world, which the Buddha demonstrated in his life of simplicity, 3 robes and a bowl, and service. So that is my current understanding of this short passage of the Heart Sutra. And I, I guess at this point I'm interested in hearing back from you about whether any of this is relatable. Does it sound like something you recognize? I don't think the Heart Sutra is just for the select few. I think it's for all of us, or at least most of us. And this prajnaparamita, I don't think is a rarity. It's something that anyone, or at least most, can realize. So can you relate to this in any way, can you think of times when your perspective has opened up and let in light, realization of complete, perfect enlightenment? But we'll stop there and go into breakout rooms and continue on next week through likely the remainder of the Heart Sutra. Thank you so much for listening.